Good day, everyone. Welcome to ME158. Sorry for the delay. And here we will talk about bones and muscles as if they are mechanical members. So these will be the content of our lecture for today. And what I want you to keep in mind is that we'll be limiting our scope to modeling the skeletal locomotory parts of our body as if they were one and the same with our mechanisms, etc. So now let's start with bones. So I think we've had a good rundown throughout our school lives on what bones are. Aside from protecting and supporting our body, they do a lot of other things such as produce blood cells and help in the homeostasis of our body. Now, for ME158, we'll be interested more on what it takes for bones to provide structural support. And to start us off, let's talk about what's inside a bone itself. So, here in this image, we have the proximal end of a human femur. So, this is the acetabulum that connects to our pelvis. And what you see here is that I don't want to draw food examples, but you can clearly see two regions. In this part of the bone, you have the solid outer part, which is the cortical bone, and you have this sort of fibrous mass in the middle. We call this the cancellous bone, or in some circles, it's a trabecular bone. And the unique thing about this is that it has fibers that orient themselves towards where the stresses flow, quote unquote, through the bone. So this is kind of an adaptive inner layer that helps the bone bear some weight. Now, if you want to see just an illustration, or at least a fuller illustration of what's inside the bone, here it is. So the marrow is actually not this cancellous part of the body. It's sort of in the more shaft-like portions of the bone itself. So in the marrow, in case you didn't know, this is where the generation of blood cells occurs, and this is usually what increases the bad lipids in your blood when you eat them. So putok batok. Now, okay, so that those are at least the general overview of what the macroscopic parts of the bone are. What are these made of? Because it's important to know what these are made of because it can tell us about the behavior, at least the expected behavior of our this particular organ. So now the bone is actually made up of at least more or less a ratio of 3 to 7. Number 3 or at least 30% of it is organics. So this is mostly collagen and this is mostly the living part of the bone itself. Now the 70%, this is the inorganic. So this is the hard matrix of the bone. And this is mostly hydroxyapatite, or in medical terms, it's HAP. Now, hydroxyapatite, it is a very complicated compound. It has calcium, it has phosphates, and it has hydroxide. And what you notice here is that if you're familiar with materials, hydroxyapatite is very close to being a ceramic. So most of our bone, at least 60-70% of it is ceramic. So if you imagine what a ceramic behaves like, you can kind of guess what kind of material this is going to look like under the stress strain curve. Now, hydroxyapatite, of course, it contains the calcium and the phosphorus, most of it in our body actually, and the bones actually function as a calcium reserve. So, for women, especially who are pregnant, the body actually extracts calcium from their bones and gives them to their infant. So yeah, it is a the bones do function as a calcium reserve. They help with the calcium balancing in our blood as well. And for egg laying animals such as reptiles and birds, I believe the bone itself is also used to generate the hard eggshell layers of eggs. So it's not just mammals who are kind of donating part of their bone to their offspring. So yeah, other animals do it too. The neat thing about hydroxyapatite is that since it is ceramic, there have been techniques wherein they were synthesized. They can be manufactured so that they can be incorporated into prosthesis. If you recall, prosthesis, especially internal ones, have trouble with integration into the body because sometimes the body thinks that it's a foreign entity that it has to fight. But if you include materials that the body should at least be familiar with, the tendency is lessened. And another fun fact, HAP, hydroxyapatite, is one of those ceramics that has already been 3D printed and it has been used for medical purposes already. So this bowl here, is actually an HAP coated prosthetic for this part of the bone, the acetabulum of the femur. At AMSEN in the OST, we do have a sample of a 3D printed acetabulum. It doesn't have the metallic inner layer, if I remember correctly. It's 3D printed in HAP all the way, but that's beside the point. Okay, so now hydroxyapatite is kind of a ceramic. So do you think the material, the bone itself, will behave in a brittle manner? Actually, it's kind of halfway. So this is a strain curve of a lot of different materials that uh, interact with the body, especially with prosthesis. So bone itself does not break all the way. It does not behave fully brittly. There is some give, so there is some plastic behavior. Now, all right. So we know that bone is made up of mostly ceramic. So where's that plasticity coming from? It's actually coming from the cancellous bones, if I infer it correctly. So here in the second graph, we have the stress strain curve for the cortical part, the solid part of the bone, which resembles a ceramic behavior a bit more, and you do have the stress strain curve of the cancellous part of the bone itself. So, depending on the density, the cancellous bone can have more of a stress tolerance. But again, it depends on which bone it is or which part of the bone it is being examined. So yes, different parts of your bone exhibit different strengths, and this is not included in in the slides. But when you are making a basic finite element analysis model of a skeletal, a structural bone like a femur or at least one of your appendages, one of the simplest ways to model a bone is to just delete the cancellous or trabecular bone section and just model it as if it's hollow. So the only thing, if you want a very simple um, FEA model of a bone, all you just have to do is to model at least only the cortical bone and siguro some of the cancellous bone in order to approximate it well, while not losing much sleep over the computing time. All right, so bone is kind of brittle but not so brittle. Now, is the strength uniform in all directions? Of course, since we're talking about organic structures, it does display some directionality. So, a difference in properties with respect to direction is something what we call anisotropy. So, isotropy is uniformity in properties, while anisotropy is the non-uniformity. So the bone is actually better in compression. It's slightly weaker in tension because, of course, bones, especially load-bearing bones, they expect compression coming from our weight. They don't exactly expect to be pulled apart, technically. And of course, bone is extremely weak in shear. Now, these are our bullet points, and what you notice is that there are two directional terms here. You have the longitudinal. The longitudinal direction refers to the axis parallel to the bone itself. So if it's a femur, the longitudinal direction is just where the bone is generally aligned. Well, the transverse direction is the perpendicular direction, which is technically any direction coming from the side. So the bone is actually very weak if it's impacted from the side, which kind of makes sense. If you want numbers to the strength of the bone, here is at least an example for the femur. Now, because bone is a very complicated structure, you did see that there is a fibrous matrix within the bone in the form of the cancellous part. The strength of each individual bone will change. That also changes with individuals. And now, there is also the matter of impact force. The bone itself, if it is impacted, or rather, if it's exposed to a force too suddenly, the brittler part of its properties start to take hold, or rather become dominant. And what happens is that the bone sort of becomes brittler when it receives sudden impact. So instead of displaying some of that plasticity that you did see in the previous graph, it will behave more like a ceramic or a very stiff polymer. So that is why when you hit the ground from a very high jump, you want to disperse the energy from the impact as soon as you can. So you don't want to uh, put all of the force, all of the energy into your bone. You want to at least send that to the more elastic parts of your body, so like your tendons or muscles, etc. And don't allow the bone itself to carry most of the impact. That is why when you see parkour athletes or performers, when they land from a very high place, they tend to roll. That is part of the energy dispersing process, so that they keep their shins essentially intact. Now let's talk about tendons. So this will be a short one, but it is very important because aside from being attachment points for muscles and bone, they do have properties that appear when the muscle is active. So tendons and ligaments, they're kind of sort of the same. They're very tough connective tissue. It's just that for tendons, they connect muscles to bone, while ligaments just keep bones in proper contact. Now, the tendons, you can think of them as the spring part of our system. The tendons, they have at least a limited range of elasticity. So when the muscle stretches on the tendon kind of behaves like a very weak spring. Now, the size of the tendon, rather the length, has some connotations for what the muscle can do. When the tendon is very short or very rigid, you will actually allow your muscle, the partnered muscle, to exact more force. While if you have a very long tendon, the tendon can stretch and contract a bit more, so you have a bit more displacement, but the muscle is kind of limited in the strength that it can apply. So that's mostly it for the tendons. So these are kind of the spring part of our system. Now, we'll be talking about skeletal muscles. So I had to label it skeletal muscles because we do have two other types in our body, but these are not usually used for locomotion. Rather, they're not usually assigned uh, to locomotion. For muscles, there is something quite unique about them. It's so unique that when you want to model muscles in systems, so there are ways to digitize our electromechanical systems into simulatable code. For muscles, there is utterly no analog for what they can do. They are in a unique class on their own, and it's mostly because of how they work. Now, because of how they work, there are uh, astounding properties that you don't see in any other machine. So like for example, the force of the muscle changes with the length of the muscle. So I'm I think you see that in springs, but the behavior of the changing of the force with the length is kind of different. Now, for the speed, yes, speed affects what the muscle can do, and of course, I think this is the more sensible one. The alignment of the muscle fiber affects the force that a muscle can apply. All right, so what are muscles? Like, what's inside the muscle? It's kind of complicated. Last year, I tried to discuss this in depth, but if you go through this slide, there is a simple point here. The muscle is kind of like a thick braided rope, wherein there are bundles of tough tissue, and within that bundle, there is a smaller set of bundles, and then if you go further and further, you will get to the fabric, or rather the what do you call this, the thread that is the most minuscule part of the muscle. So it's basically a very tough braided rope muscle. Does this actually behave like the threads of a rope? No, because if you zoom in to the very tiny fabric of the muscle fiber itself, these are called myofibrils. Now the myofibrils, they are made up of a series of muscle units called the sarcomeres. Now the sarcomeres, if we zoom in on one microfibril, they're here. You can think of the myofibrils as being consisting of several chains of sarcomeres. And what makes the sarcomeres very special in terms of their action is that they're actually made up of two main types of filaments, the actin filament and the myosin filament. So, for those who remember their elementary biology, I think this will be familiar. Or rather, I don't know if it's elementary or high school biology. You tell me. So you have your actin filaments here and you have your myosin filaments here. What you notice with the myosin is that meron silang parang mga ulo ng toge or myosin heads. And the job of the myosin heads is to grab onto the actin filament and then pull it. Pull it in the direction where the head will contract. So think of it as, okay, so the head touches the actin filament, then it pulls the actin filament to the left. Wait, let me check if it's actually visible. Oh, it's not. My okay. So hold on. I didn't know my mouse was not visible. So okay, let me check. Yeah, okay, so it's visible now. So you think of the myosin head. It grabs onto the actin, then it pulls it towards the its contracting direction, and then it lets go. And then it does this over and over. So it's kind of like little hands grabbing on rope and then pulling it down, quote unquote, pulling it down. So if you have several bundles of these actin myosin pairs, you get the sarcomere. So here in this image, you have a relaxed sarcomere, you have your myosin filaments here, and then you have your actin sheaths. Now, when the muscle wants to contract, the myosin will actually pull these actin sheaths closer and closer to the A band here. And below in this image is what the illustrated muscle would look like when it's fully, quote unquote, fully contracted. Now, if you want to imagine, if you need help in imagining the process, this is kind of what it looks like. So you have your toge head here pulling on the actin filament. It doesn't look particularly strong. I also can't imagine being particularly strong, but somehow it is. And if you notice, there is a flashing animation there. There's a sort of flash. Hold on. There is some flashing that is going on. Yeah, I believe that flashing is indicative of the ATP that the myosin head is absorbing. Here is a crash course version, which I think makes the absorption of the ATP more obvious. So the ATP allows the myosin heads to get the energy to pull on the actin, and then it moves on to contract the muscle, etc. And because of this, there are some implications for what the force that the muscle can do. And this is kind of what affects the muscle's ability to exert force mostly revolves around this system. What can affect the impact, or what can affect the performance of this actin myosin arrangement? So if you can think of it carefully, I'll allow you to do that. You can pause the video if you want to imagine it. But let's go on to the first implication. So the actin myosin pair, their action depends on their amount of contact. So if you can imagine, if the myosin heads are the ones that are exerting force on the actin filaments, then it would stand to reason that if the actin sheaths and the myosin heads have more contact with one another, then they can transmit much more force. So here we have a force displacement diagram. Let's start from here. Let's imagine that our muscle is stretched and the muscle wants to contract to its maximum contraction. So we start here. So we have our myosin heads. They're sort of not fully unsheathed. If they're 100% unsheathed, no contraction would be possible. So maybe some of the myosin can still touch the actin sheaths here. So when the muscle exerts force at this length, there's only a limited amount of myosin heads that can transmit the force. So it's quite weak. The amount of force that the muscle can send at this length is very small. But as the actin sheaths kind of get contracted, as the actin move closer to the myosin, more and more of the actin becomes available for the myosin to interact with. And because there's more actin to pull on, there's more force that can be transmitted. And eventually, you will get to a point wherein there is maximum contact between the actin and the myosin parts of your sarcomere. What happens then is, okay, is this the maximum? Not quite. The muscle can still contract a bit further, but as you do, the actin kind of starts to interfere with one another. So as the actin sheets from the opposite sides of the sarcomere kind of overlap, you start to lose some of the contact that you had before during this peak. So as the muscle actually moves closer and closer, starts to contract even more, there's less of the actin to grab onto, so the force kind of drops off again. So this is kind of the unique profile of the force length relationship of the muscle. Now, uh, you have to recall that the muscle itself is part of a continuous connective tissue. So when the muscle is contracting, there is also another part of the muscle that is being used. So for this part, let's imagine that you go from a very contracted state of the muscle and then you start stretching the muscle again, but you're still exerting force. Now, as the muscle is being stretched while it's resisting, there is a point wherein the connective tissue that is binding the muscle together starts to resist. Remember, it is our connective tissue is kind of like a polymer. So when you stretch on it a bit, there will be some kind of plastic or elastic resistance. And this shows up here. When the muscle is kind of stretched beyond its nominal length, that part of your muscle starts to add on to the resistance to the force. So if you add the active part and the passive part of the force resistance, you get this particular blue curve. So muscle is kind of unique in this way, and there's also more. If you recall, it's not just the length of the muscle that affects the force that it can apply. The speed at which it contracts or extends also affects how much force it can deliver. So I want to pay attention to this graph here. So instead of a force displacement curve, you now have a force velocity curve. And what you notice here is that you have two sides. You have one that is moving towards contracting the muscle. So this positive velocity axis indicates contraction, and this negative part of the axis indicates extension of the muscles. Now in the middle, you see that there's a non-zero value. You can think of this as the muscle exerting a lot of force, a lot of pulling force, but the muscle is not neither extending nor contracting. This is what we call isometric contraction. The muscle is attempting to contract, but its length is not changing. So you can think of it as, let's say you're in a gym. Imagine that you're holding the dumbbells steadily with your arms in 90 degrees orientation. So your biceps brachii, you can feel it sort of exerting some force to keep the arms or the forearms in a particular position, but the length of the biceps brachii, it's not moving. So that is isometric contraction. Now, if you try to pull your dumbbells towards you, you try to flex your biceps, the biceps, they contract at a particular speed. We call that concentric contraction. So the muscle is pulling and the muscle is actually shortening. So that is alignment. Now, for the other one is I think this is the bad one. Let's say you're trying to test your strength using some dumbbells, you're trying to lift weights that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to. And you try to lift it, you try to flex your arms, but your biceps, no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't even lift the dumbbells off the ground. And you kind of felt like your biceps were being stretched, even though they're pulling as hard as they can. So in the situation where the muscle wants to pull, it's exerting a lot of pull, but it's being stretched against its will. That is called eccentric contractions. It's kind of weird. You can think of the contraction in this term as sort of the muscle willing itself to contract. While the modifier, the first term in these names, they are actually what's happening to the muscle. So, okay, when you're doing isometric contraction, that's kind of the nominal force that you are applying, that the muscle can apply. So what happens then if you're contracting, the muscle is being contracted while it's pulling, but its contraction is quite fast. So imagine that your biceps are shortening quite fast. Uh, on the microscopic level, you'd imagine that the actin sheaths, they are moving past the myosin faster than the myosin can grab. So when the muscles are undergoing concentric contraction, the myosins, they aren't able to grab as well to the myosin as they would have if under isometric contraction. So what's happening is that there's less force being transmitted when you're under concentric contraction. And the faster you contract the muscle, or rather the faster the muscle shortens, there's even less force that is being transmitted. Hence, we have this downward curve here for the force transmission. Now, for the eccentric contraction, the reverse of this does not quite happen. What happens rather is that when the muscle is stretched, even though it's trying to contract at a very fast speed, the elastic portion of the muscle starts chiming in. It starts contributing a bit more resistance. So when your muscle is forced to stretch, even though it's pulling, it's actually transmitting a lot more force than it would have. So yeah, eccentric contraction allows for more force than if your muscle was pulling while it's not moving. It's kind of weird, but that's what we have. And if you combine this relationship between force, length, and velocity in a muscle, you kind of get this funny little curve. Para siyang kumot na may natutulog or may nagtatago or something like that. Will we be making use of this? Nah, this is just for your know-how. Think of it as like, okay, so we have the PVT for thermodynamics, and we have this funny curve or rather funny surface in ME158. So yeah, that's it. Now, for the third thing, fiber orientation also matters. And with this respect, skeletal muscles tend to be grouped into three, but we'll only be looking into two for now. So the first one is parallel arrangement. So you can think of the parallel arrangement as sort of the muscle fibers, like for example, your biceps brachii, the muscle fibers being aligned to the tendons. So they're parallel to the tendons. So they can be just straight up normal parallel, like for example, your abs. Your abs are actually parallel muscles. They're parallel to their tendons. Or they can be fusiform like your biceps. So you have this bit of bulge in the middle, but it is still parallel. For the other type of muscle, we have, oh, sorry, we have what we call the pennate muscles. So they're pennate because they kind of resemble like a quill pen in real life. So there is a unipennate wherein you have a tendon running into the middle of the muscle, and the muscle fibers are kind of flaring out like barbs of a feather. So for unipennate, you have one column or one row of barbs, quote unquote barbs. And for bipennate, you have two rows of barbs, so kind of like a real feather. And you can have multi-pennate systems wherein you have quote unquote multiple barbs arising from a single tendon or two. You also have convergent muscles like your pecs, but we won't be examining them because they're a little complicated. The force is spread out over a highly variable area. So this will kind of, we won't be using this much. There is also the matter of more hydrostatic-ish or rather more circular types of muscles, but we will not be examining these as well. Now, our main comparison will be in between parallel and pennate muscles. So what's the difference? So here in this illustration, we have muscle A, which is made up of parallel fibers, and then you have muscle B, made up of pennate fibers. Now, what you notice in this graph, which is for the force length and force velocity relationship, the parallel fibers allow for a lot of displacement, but they don't allow for a lot of force to be transmitted. So there is a sacrifice of force transmission for greater displacement or greater ability to change dimensions. Now, for the pennate fibers or the pennate muscles, they have the opposite trade-off. They can't really contract all that much because the muscle fibers, they're oriented not in the same direction as the tendon, so there's going to be some limit to the contraction. But they can transmit a lot more force. They have a higher peak force in the force length relationship, and they also have a higher isometric force in the force velocity relationship. So pellets fibers tend to be much stronger, while parallel fibers tend to allow for more elasticity in the shape and the dimensions. Now, how do we reconcile this? If you want to think of it in NSI 13 terms, think of it as our muscles having some general stress limits. So, like, for example, your muscles only allow zero point 0.3 MPa maximum for all of its fibers. And what's happening is that for a parallel fiber muscle, the cross-sectional area, which is where the force is traveling, is kind of small. It only allows for a small transmission of force. It only allows for small forces. So force equals stress times area. Now, for the pennate muscles, the force is going to travel along the muscle fiber. But if you take the perpendicular area of that, there's a lot more. There is way more cross-sectional area in the pennate fibers, hence allowing for a higher peak in force transmission. So that is, those are the things that are affecting muscles. And again, this affects how we model muscles in a control system or systems engineering environment. So there have been attempts to model the human body as if it was an electromechanical system. So if you recall our lectures in ME 160, we had our control system diagrams. I'm not sure if you're from the first batch or the second batch. I remember in the second batch, I tried to introduce the box diagrams, the control systems diagrams that I think you should be able to touch in EE28. But the problem with our bodies, or rather our muscles, is that the muscle is so unique that you have to define a completely new element in order to model it. So essentially, you had to make up a new you had to make up a new element, electromechanical element for that. So this particular modeling of a single muscle is based on a study by Hill in 1938. So Hill's model is assuming that we have pennate muscle. So there's a pennation angle here. If it's a parallel muscle, you can just reduce the pennation angle to zero. Now you have for each and every muscle group, you can dissolve it into two components, or rather three. There is the tendon, which displays some springy characteristics, so hence the spring here. And of course, your muscle fiber is also made up of connective tissue. There is some springiness to them, but the main action is happening here in the contractile element. And what you notice here is that there are differing force directions. So the orange vectors here pertain to the forces traveling along the tendons, while the purple vector here indicates what's actually going to the muscles. So this model is a sort of culmination of what we've been talking about so far. So we have our tendons, which behave like springs. We have our muscles with their funny relationship with length and velocity. And of course, our muscles also have some elasticity to them. And yeah, this is quite complicated. And if you want to model it, we won't do that in ME158, but if you are interested, there is some light geometry that you have to negotiate with. And there are some statistical properties that you have to take into account. So you require the length of the muscle and the tendon. You have the tendon length, muscle length, and you also need some properties of the muscle. Like for example, how much force can it exert when its length is not quite moving, and for example, its maximum contraction velocity as well, which we will not cover in ME158. So if you want to look at this, or if you want to make a thesis out of it, you can use the at least some of the references that will be provided in the last slide of this lecture. But yeah, that is how, or rather, this kind of modeling is how we interpret muscles as electromechanical systems. And like any electromechanical systems, when it receives a signal, its action takes some time to actually take place. So, like for example, you can think of this black line, the stimulation, as the external disturbance, or the right hand side of your equation. So you input a pulse, or rather a ramp, a temporary rectangular pulse here, and the muscle responds like this green signal here. So it's kind of like behaving like an overdamped system. So it's delayed in rising and it's delayed in contracting. And that is basically it for our lecture. So it's kind of short without any back and forth discussion. And here is the references. Now, please be reminded that you will be having in-person or face-to-face lab in IE1 this Friday. Make sure you are there. And if nothing else, thank you so much and stay safe.